Dodd-Frank is a U.S.-based law, as you well know, and yet the markets that Dodd-Frank seeks to regulate, specifically under Title VII, is the OTC derivatives market, which is a global market. And that creates one of the biggest problems around this area because other regulators around the world are grappling with these same issues around moving OTC derivatives trading to exchanges and other trading platforms. We're going to dig into some of those differences and where some of the difficulties might lie. My guest today is George Bolenbacher from Kinetics Trading Partners. George, thanks for coming by.
Thank you.
So first of all, there are sort of three key issues that you've kind of identified around this difficult area of U.S. versus the rest of the world and how everyone's dealing with this issue of OTC derivatives reform. And the first one is jurisdiction. So I wonder if you could kind of lay that out for us.
Right. Yeah, these three things make it the hardest part of Dodd-Frank that I've seen so far.
Okay.
So the first problem is that the various jurisdictions are in various stages of formulating things or not, deciding they're not going to have anything there, getting comments. So you're dealing with moving parts in that respect. The second is where they have some form of regulation or plan, they aren't the same as the U.S. So you're now dealing with different requirements in different geographies, even where they do exist.
Okay.
And the third and the most difficult is nobody's really defined what determines what jurisdiction you're in. When I do a trade, whose jurisdiction do I have to deal with? That's very difficult to determine. So those three make it really hard.
And on that last point, there are you can see how there may be potential different iterations, right? If you're, if you're a major swap participant in the U.S. and yet you're trading it, can you maybe give us an example of how some of these difficulties might look in the real world?
Sure. So the U.S. has this category called major swap participant. It's a large non-dealer in the marketplace. No other jurisdiction that I've seen has anything like that. So now let's imagine that you have a U.S. dealer who does a swaps trade with a European or Japanese large customer who would be an MSP in the U.S., but they're not in the U.S.
Right.
The trade is done on a SEF in the U.S., but it's cleared on a London clearinghouse. Who has to report? Do you have to report what the MSP would normally have to report if they were in the U.S.?
Right.
It's not at all clear. And then we could flip it over completely and say, how about if there's a U.S. dealer, a U.S. customer who is an MSP, but it's a non-U.S. dealer who's not subject to Dodd-Frank.
Right.
Typically the dealer reports on all this sort of thing. So if the MSP is U.S., if the customer and the dealer is non-U.S., do we have to report? Who has to report? Who's got responsibility? Who's checking?
Right.
So you could just a simple little transaction, you can see how all the parts can be pretty complicated.
Right, exactly, yeah. Well, I appreciate you kind of laying that out because that does give a really good view as to how complicated this could become. Now, if we look at the U.S. and say Europe as sort of the two biggest marketplaces for OTC derivatives, can you tell us a little bit about where we're at, where the those two places are in terms of harmonization or how close or how far away they are?
Right. So some fundamental differences.
Yeah.
One has to do with the clearing mandate. In the U.S., the clearing and trading mandate, exchange trading mandate, are what's called bottoms up. That is, whoever wants to clear it or trade it applies to the regulator, and the regulator says yes or no. In Europe, they have that, but they also have a top-down, which says that the EC could decide that a certain contract needs to be cleared even if no one's applied for that. Not really sure how that would work in the U.S. The end-user exemption in the U.S., for example, is specifically at the trade level. The customer has to be qualified to be an end user, and then each trade has to qualify based on the risk and the product. And that exemption, it has to do with trading and clearing, but not reporting. All those trades have to be reported.
Everything has to be reported. Okay.
And there's no size limitation there. As long as the trade qualifies for end user exemption, it can be as big as you could imagine. In Europe, they don't have end user exemption specifically. They have an exemption by entity. And that exemption, if you're below a certain size and you're the right kind of entity, you don't report. You don't report.
At all. Okay.
Right? You don't clear and you don't do it on the exchange and you don't report. Okay, and the EU has said when you get above a certain size and you're now in the bigger category, you have to do all your trades from there on the exchange, and you have to report all your past trades, and you have to clear all your past uncleared trades.
All your past trades?
Yes, you have to go that
Wow,
route.
okay.
And then one other little wrinkle, in the U.S., the clearinghouses are supposed to act as self-regulatory organizations.
Right.
Our friends at the CME have discovered about self-regulatory organizations with MF Global.
Right.
In Europe, there's no concept that the clearinghouse would be a self-regulatory organization. So the U.S. regulators may have a concern with recognizing, allowing a clearinghouse in Europe that doesn't have the same responsibilities that you would in the U.S.
Huh, okay. It's extremely complicated. If I'm in this business, George, I mean, I ought to be ready to throw up my hands. I mean, what are you recommending? What are you when you're talking to folks? What are you telling them? Here's how to deal with this, because clearly so many different jurisdictions at different places. Some are, as you say, aren't even addressing it at all. I mean, what's an MSP supposed to do, for instance?
Right. So let me just say the first thing is we can help you.
Okay.
So that's the first point. But you need to get your domestic, your single jurisdiction house in order. If you're a U.S. dealer primarily, you need to get that in order. And then you can start working as facts become clearer and we know more on your cross-border transactions. But we hear people waiting around, we're not in such a big hurry. The point is that domestically, we know a lot, we can do a lot, we can get ready. Better do that now, because as things evolve in the international sphere, you want to have time and resources to work on that sort of thing.
Right.
And by the way, none of this talks about the Volcker Rule, which is the other half of Dodd-Frank that will impact all of this. So if you can get Title VII good to go in the U.S. or in your jurisdiction, and you've got your tasks in line for international, then as the Volcker Rule starts to become more and more clear and more requirements, you'll have resources and time to deal with that when you're ready.
Okay, very good. Well, I think we'll leave Volcker to another discussion, because we could be here for quite a long time talking about the issues around Volcker. But we've been talking about sort of taking the world view of Dodd-Frank and the differences between the U.S. and other jurisdictions and where they are in terms of OTC derivatives reform. I've been joined by George Bolenbacher from Kinetics Trading Partners. Thanks for watching.